I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to look at the feature called Bounce in Place. This allows us to take a MIDI region and to convert it into an audio file, which is useful for all kinds of reasons. Let's see how it works. So firstly, let's have a listen to this track that we're going to be working with. So there's a simple little 8-bar arrangement, and what I want to do now is to focus on the beat loop, which you can see is the final track down here, containing lots of 1-bar beat loops. I'm going to focus on the very last bar here, and what I want to do is to bounce this in place, convert this MIDI into audio, in other words. I'm going to Control-click this region, and you can see that Bounce in Place is one of the first options that's available here at the top for me. Now, if it's not there in the list for you, don't worry, come down to Bounce and Join, and you'll find Bounce in Place there. And when you select this option, up pops a dialog box. And the first thing I can do here is to give the name, or at least the file that I'm about to create, a name. You can see that by default it's called beats._BIP for Bounce in Place, but I can call this anything. I could call this, for instance, drums stretch. Now, before I go and click OK, we need to look at some of the other options that are available here to me. So where is this audio file that I'm about to create going to be placed? Well, it's going to be placed on a new track. I have no audio files within my project, so of course I can't choose an existing selected track onto which to place this file. I'm going to choose a new one. Now comes some really important decisions. The source file, the actual MIDI region itself, from which this audio file is going to be created. What do I want to do with that once I've created the audio file? Do I want to leave it alone, which means it will look exactly as it does now and it will continue to play? Do I want to mute it so that effectively the audio version replaces the MIDI, or do I want to delete it? Well, that feels like quite a reckless option. What if this doesn't go right? What if you inadvertently end up deleting something that you want to be able to get back? I wouldn't advocate that particular choice. I'm going to go with mute, and what that's going to do, of course, is to just mute the original MIDI and provide me with the audio version instead. Now, some crucial options lie ahead. Do I want to bypass the effect plugins that are on this track? Now, you can see that my beat loop is here and at the moment is passing through a compressor. Now, if I tick this box, the audio file isn't going to print the effect that compressor is having. It's not going to make it a permanent part of this file. Instead, it's going to bypass the compressor, produce an uncompressed audio file, but it's going to then copy the compression settings that I'm using onto that track. So in other words, if I suddenly decide I want to use more compression later on, I can increase those settings, and that's a really useful thing. It means that I haven't got to commit to the effect at this point if I don't want to. Equally, if I do want to do that, I can uncheck this box, and what will happen is the beat loop will print the compressor settings as part of that audio file. For now, I'm going to bypass it. And we're going to come back to this last option in a little while when we see what other effects can be added to MIDI regions and how they affect the way that Bounce in Place might work. So for now, what I'm going to do is to just press OK. Now, when I do that, Logic will race through and produce my bounced version of this file here. You can see that as I chose it for it to, it's muted the original MIDI. And for now, this is going to sound exactly the same. And you can see, of course, that it's also brought across this compressor, meaning that this is an uncompressed audio file, which is now passing through the compression to have the same settings as the MIDI version of this same beat loop. So at the moment, it sounds exactly the same, but of course I now have audio control over the way that this beat loop might behave. So one thing I could do, for instance, would be to open it up, come into the File tab down here within the audio region editor, come to Functions, and I could reverse it. So if I wanted a reversed version of this beat loop right at the end, I can do that. So that's nice, and it could loop back round with a reversed slice at the end. I'm actually going to just turn that back round though for a second. I'm going to unreverse that audio slice. And instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to time stretch it. I'm going to hold Option and simply drag this loop out so it becomes twice the length that it did before. And that's going to produce this kind of glitchy, stretched effect. And what I might decide to do would be to just use the second half of that loop, pop it into that bar, and come out of solo mode so I can hear the sort of time-stretched alternative right at the end. Okay, so that's nice. So a couple of audio-only features that I can't do with MIDI. Now, what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to leave that exactly as it is at the moment, and I'm going to come to one of the other beat loop slices at the beginning of this track instead. And before I start thinking about bouncing it all over again, what I'm actually going to do is to add a reverb to this track. So I'm going to set up a reverb using Logic's Chroma Reverb, and I'm going to make some pretty exaggerated choices here about the amount of reverb actually on this file to kind of demonstrate how we can bounce in place with effects. So I'm going to solo this track, and we're going to hear now that it's a much more reverberant beat loop than it was before. And we can hear all of that extra decay. Now, I'm going to leave that here for a second. I'm going to come back to my first beat loop, and again, I'm going to Control-click to select Bounce in Place. Now, this time, what I want to do is I'm going to include the effect plugins within my choice, this particular bounce that I'm going to make. But crucially, what I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm not going to cut off the end of the reverb at the point that that region ends. In other words, you can see over here, when we did our original bounce in place, this region ended up being exactly the same length as the MIDI region, which created the audio bounce in the first place. And the same thing is going to happen here. At the end of bar 1, this region is just going to stop, which means that all of the reverb tail is going to be abruptly cut off at this point, unless I ask Logic to include it. So by doing that, what's going to happen is that I have an option to include that audio tail in the file, which means that Logic is going to capture it all. However, at the moment, it's not going to give me the option to have all of that in the new region it's going to create. In other words, even though it's going to capture all of that reverb decay, it's still going to stop the region at the beginning of bar 3. In order to have it play all the way through, I also need to click this box, which is going to include the audio tail in the region that I'm going to create. Not just the audio file, but the region too. And one last thing to look at. Down here at the bottom, there is the option to normalize a file. In other words, what happens if I choose an on option here is that as Logic bounces down or renders this piece of audio, it normalizes it. Basically, it looks at the volume of the file and it finds the loudest moment and it turns up to 0 dB, making it as loud as it can possibly be. And I would always make sure you don't switch that option on. What you want to do here is to preserve the volume of the file that you're working with, to make your workflow as sinuous as possible. And if the first thing you do is to normalize all of the audio files that you're working with, you'll just have to turn the volume down on every single track that you do this for. So keep that option, normalize, off. I'm now going to press OK. And what we should find is that this time Logic is going to create a new region which includes the reverb tail. And sure enough, it's done that. Because I selected a new track, we've got another new track, and this time this region is going to include all of the reverb decay. Let's hear it. And Logic has ensured that we don't lose, we've faded all the way to silence before it then stops that bounce process happening. So this is a really nice way of being able to take individual pieces of MIDI and convert them to audio so that they can be processed in all kinds of ways. So you can see that with Bounce in place, we've got a chance to benefit not only from the MIDI region that we've created in the first place, but all of the ways in which we can then process an audio version of it afterwards.